Hello, I'm Howie Sheriff, your host for the new and continuing You Call This Yoga Internet TV talk show. That's a mouthful in itself. Our focus is on accessible yoga and the different modes that teachers around our country and world are sharing their passion in this realm. We've had guests over the past couple of months who have shared adaptive, healing, emotional, veterans, chair, and other modes of yoga. We have a special guest today who I've had the pleasure of knowing for several years and have studied with too. Carol Krucoff is a yoga therapist in Durham, North Carolina, who's also had other careers and experiences that have influenced where she is today. We'll be getting to Carol in just a little bit in terms of talking with her, hopefully nothing under her skin, and we'll be sharing how she has proceeded in her career to this point. But a little bit about our show. We are an interactive show seeking you, our viewers and listeners, to engage the guest, and maybe me too, on the topics that we have offered. You can call in at 919-518-9773. You can Skype in at Computers 2K Voice, or you can chat with us on the Nissan Communications page by logging in and typing in the box. We also have sponsors each week that help us to bring you the show. This week's sponsor is Blue Lotus Yoga and Movement in Raleigh. Blue Lotus is a wonderful partner that is a studio in downtown Raleigh who has supported us through our ventures at Yoga Fest, NC, Yoga Fest Raleigh, as well as other fundraisers and community events. Thank you, Blue Lotus. They'll be sharing our fun and yum good health tip later. But for now, let's come back to our wonderful guest in the studio, Carol Krucoff. Enough of me describing Carol. Let's get you a picture of Carol live sitting next to me. Good morning, Carol.
Good morning, Howie. Very nice to be here.
Thank you. Carol has been involved with You Call This Yoga in several modes, teaching at Yoga Fest over the past several years in our continuing education channel, as well as the general public channel that we offer. Let's tune into Carol now and learn a little bit about, or maybe a lot, about her history and how she became interested in fitness and yoga several decades ago. We'll just say 2 decades ago because she's such a youth.
I am very proud of my age, Howie. I've been practicing yoga for more than 40 years. I had a birthday recently and turned 63, so I am proud of my age, and I think it also informs the kind of work that I do now, specializing in yoga for older adults and people with health challenges. My first career, however, was as a journalist. I have a BS in journalism, which I know makes people kind of roll their eyes, from the University of Maryland. I was fortunate enough to be a journalist really in the height of journalism. I worked for the Washington Post for 10 years. I'm from the Washington, D.C. area originally. And I was at the this is how old I am. When I started at the Washington Post, we used typewriters. In the first year that I was there, we converted from typewriters to computers. And in that transition, my budding yoga practice became very important. I've always been a person who loves physical activity. When I was a kid, I danced. When all the other little girls quit dance class, I kept going. I have a minor in dance. I took so many dance classes at the University of Maryland that I minored in dance, majored in journalism. And at the Washington Post, at that time, I was a regular runner. When my kids were young, I did karate. I have a second-degree black belt in karate. I've always loved the intersection between movement and health. And that's what I specialized in as a journalist. I was the founding editor of the health section at the Washington Post. This, again, was back when Ben Bradley was my editor. Katharine Graham was the publisher. Everybody read the newspaper. It was before the internet. It was really prime time. When we converted to computers at the Washington Post, those initial computers had very little ergonomic sensibility. So I would be, there I was at 20-something on deadline in a high-pressure environment. I loved my job, but I was looking at these little screens with a fixed keyboard, and there was a lot of tension involved, and I got a lot of tension in my neck and shoulders, and of course the whole deadline crunch was a very stressful scene. I would run in the morning. Every morning I'd go on a 3-mile run, and that certainly helped, but it also made me very tight. So I started taking a weekly yoga class, and that weekly yoga class was really transformative in helping with my neck and shoulder pain. I went on later to write a book about yoga for neck and shoulder pain, in some part inspired by all my years working at computers. But it wasn't until probably the first 20 years of my yoga practice was a weekly yoga class. Like many people, I entered the realm of yoga thinking, well, this is, a fitness activity, and it's good for flexibility and it's good for relaxation. Both of those were things that I needed. And no matter where I was, I always stopped and went to that weekly yoga class. We moved to the Triangle area in 1988. My husband Mitch is a cardiologist. He got an amazing job at Duke, which he's still there as a cardiologist at Duke. I kept writing for the Washington Post by writing a column for them called Body Works that focused on the intersection between physical activity and health, the kind of emerging area of exercise science. Still just taking my weekly yoga class. And I decided to take a yoga teacher training in the late 1990s. I think it was 1999. There was back then, there were not very many yoga teacher trainings. There were maybe a handful around the country. And living in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, there was not really an accessible yoga teacher training. And then I learned, I was writing an article for Yoga Journal about yoga in the Triangle area. And in calling around and seeing what was coming in the Triangle area, I learned that a very prominent yoga teacher from Canada, Esther Myers, would be offering a 2-year, 750-hour yoga teacher training here in the Triangle. And it just seemed like too good an opportunity to miss. It was literally 15 minutes from my house. Over the course of 2 years, we met for 6-day weekends. I can't remember how many. I think it was six-day intensive, and in between there was lots of homework. It was a transformative experience. It was really amazing, and I did not intend on teaching yoga. I wanted to deepen my own practice, and I also was very interested in having that credential for my writing to be, a yoga teacher. As part of that training, Esther required us to do 12 hours of community service, to volunteer, to do SEVA, to do service. And for my 12 hours of service, I volunteered at the Durham VA Medical Center, which was where my husband was working as a cardiologist. Duke and the VA are very closely intertwined, so he works both sides of the street. And I knew that they had a gerontology rehab program there, which was for veterans, mostly 50 and up, 50, 60, 70, 80, mostly men. There were a few women who had lots and lots of chronic illness. They would not be in this program if they weren't recovering from something serious. So coming out of a yoga teacher training where I had been doing lots of sun salutations and arm balances and, all these kind of party poses, here I was in a room full of very debilitated, very lovely men who had no idea what yoga was or what I was doing. They, yogurt? What kind of yogurt you gonna feed us, honey? What, strawberry yogurt? No, we're gonna do yoga today. I was very frightened that I would hurt these guys because they had just had heart attacks. They had shoulder replacements. One guy had shrapnel in his wrist. But they were absolutely lovely hearted, willing, interested, present, just terrific people. And to kind of figure out, well, what should I do? What could I do? I watched their calisthenic class. They had what they called floor exercise class that they were doing as part of their gerontology rehab. So I went and observed what they were doing in that class. And for example, one of the things that the instructor had them do was get on all fours, hands and knees, which in the yoga community we call that table pose. So then from hands and knees position, they'd start to do something they called hump and slump, arching their spine both into extreme flexion and to extreme extension. And the light went off in my head. And I said, well, that's cat-cow. I can teach that. That's something we do. And if they're doing that anyway, it's already been vetted by their medical staff. So I started with what they were already doing in calisthenics, and many of their floor X were very similar to yoga poses. So I went in with that. The yoga, they tell you to start where you are. I started there, and then I added the breath. And I added awareness, the tools of yoga, and the guiding principles. Move to challenge, not to strain. And this was very, very difficult for these men who were all soldiers, because soldiers are taught to kind of disconnect, to suck it up, to kind of ignore the physical sensations of their body. They need to do that in order to do the job of a soldier. This is also true with many athletes. So starting to teach in this population where people were so disconnected and they were so used to pushing and striving, to teach them that it's just as important to undo as it is to do. And for many of us in our culture, it's even more important to learn how to undo and to let go and to relax and to notice and what's here and what's present and what are you feeling and how are you feeling. So bringing the tools of yoga into this environment was a transformative experience for me. I was required by Esther's program to do 12 hours of volunteer work, and originally I thought, well, I'll do this for 12 weeks and then I'll stop. I wound up volunteering at the Durham VA teaching yoga for 5 years because it was so rewarding. I learned so much. My students were so excited by the practice. They'd come and tell me, I've been able to cut back on my high blood pressure medication. I'm not using my cane as much. I got down and up from the floor for the first time in 10 years. I mean, just important functional markers for how the yoga practice was helping. They were sleeping better, medication reduction. It was amazing, and that's how I got into therapeutic yoga. A long answer to your question, Howie.
Well, it's a good thing I only brought 3 questions to ask you today. But at least they're substantive answers, for sure. What I'd like to do is roll back a little bit onto some of the points that Carol had made in her comments. One of them was that for teachers out there listening, that there is room to go observe other groups and to get familiar out of your comfort zone in terms of who you're serving without diving in without the potential of causing damage. And there are programs out there, such as Carol's senior program that we'll get to later. The point is there is room to expand your envelope. For practitioners that are listening, you might have heard that Carol just went to a class once a week. not to say just, because it was still a commitment, but the idea is getting started involves commitment, but it doesn't have to take an inordinate amount of time. You can look at what you're doing, and if you add some focused, easy breathing to the process, then in a form you're creating your own yoga practice where you are. Carol mentioned about dealing with folks that are injured at the Durham VA. Well, she's a pioneer in volunteering at the Durham VA, and wonderfully, our organization has a partnership with the Durham VA, and we continue what Carol has seeded years ago with our associate, Laura Nickerson. So we encourage veterans to reach out to their facilities or folks with other challenges to see if there's ways to bring yoga into your healing space. Let's pause for a moment and prepare for our first pearl of wisdom. While we're preparing for that, Carol also mentioned about this slump, and what was the term you said?
Hump and slump was
Hump
what they called
and
it.
slump. So for you folks out there who might be humped over your computer terminal while you're attempting to multitask while listening or watching to the show, I'll invite you to press your feet down, take a breath, and lift your spine so that you can take in our next pearl.
So I'd like to ask you to notice what you're sitting on. Yes, you're probably sitting on a chair, but what part of your anatomy are you sitting on? The part of your anatomy that is best to sit on for good posture is your sit bones. To find your sit bones, I'd like you to shamelessly reach under your bottom, and you'll feel these two knobs at the base of the pelvis. And then move the flesh away so that those knobs drop into the chair seat. And then rest your hands on your lap. So take a moment and get grounded. Feel the weight of those two sit bones releasing down into the chair. Feet can be flat on the floor. If they don't reach the floor, you might bring the floor to you with a footstool. Get grounded, and then from that place of grounding, lengthen your spine.
All right, everybody. Are you feeling a bit more grounded than before? Have you noticed the bottom of your feet? Are both feet actually pressing downward? Or do you have your feet crossed in some funny, obscure sort of way that's just regular for you? I know that I play a little dance with my feet throughout the day. And as we mature, we settle more into our collapse. I'm going to ask Carol to review some of these nuances about these sit bones, because some of us have more padding than other and may not really be aware of where these sit bones are. Carol, can you touch base on that literally?
Well, I'm not sure how literal I can be. I'm not going to reach out and grab your sit bones, but you can do that for your own sit bones. So the fancy medical name for the sit bones is the ischial tuberosities, and they are located right at the base of the pelvis. So the word pelvis comes from the Latin for basin. I'm making it kind of looks like a lotus, but kind of a basin with my hands. And one of the nice alignment cues that we do in yoga is to try to keep the pelvis in neutral. So if some of us walk around with a sway back, so if our pelvic bowl, if our basin was filled with water and we have a sway back, all that water in the pelvic bowl would go forward. And then some of us kind of tuck our tailbone under like a scared dog, and then the water would tip out. But if we're balanced right on our sit bones, which are right at the base of our pelvic bowl, then if there was water in that pelvic bowl, it would not slosh out. So the way to find your sit bones is really, one of my teachers, and I'm not sure which teacher it was. I always like to credit where credit is due, but I remember one of my teachers talking about shamelessly reaching under your bottom, and I use that term all the time because people are kind of, what? You want me to touch my tush? What? Well, you know, part of our yoga practice is learning to love ourselves, all of ourselves, just as we are. So find your sit bones. If you don't know where they are, then you're not going to be able to sit correctly. And let's face it, most of us sit a lot. And as long as we're sitting, we might as well sit with good posture. It's not uncommon for me to see someone for yoga therapy who comes in for, say, back pain or neck pain. And the first thing that I do, the yoga therapy session where I offered at Duke Integrative Medicine, for initial visits, first-time clients, is 90 minutes. And the first 20 minutes, we sit and talk. And we sit in chairs. I do not teach sitting on the floor very often. A person has to be very, very fit to be able to sit with good posture comfortably on the floor. We sit in chairs and we talk. Why are they there? What, tell me a little bit about yourself. We review medical history. And it's not uncommon for the person to be sitting across from me, sitting on their sacrum, which is the triangular bone at the base of the spine. Think of a teenage kid kind of slumped, sitting forward in the chair, sitting on their sacrum or tailbone, the spine curves down. And the person sitting across from me will have be sitting that way. And they'll say, oh, my back is just been so much pain and my neck is so much pain. I've seen all these doctors and I've had this in injections and this and that. And I'll listen and I'll say, I hear that you're in a lot of pain and that's, I'm sure, very troubling. One thing I'd like you to notice right now is your posture and how are you sitting. And then we'll talk about finding their sit bones and sitting with good posture. And darn, that doesn't make a big difference. And this is somebody who's been in chronic pain for years. I'm not saying that this instantly relieves it or makes it go away, but it's a start. These are habits of body, like how we sit, how we stand, how we move, our habits of mind, like are we very negative thinkers? Are we always catastrophizing? Both habits of body and habits of mind are things that we can learn to address and change in a positive manner, in a direction that moves toward health with the yoga practice. So, of course, I would hope that all the people who are listening and watching would recognize that yoga is about a lot more than the physical body. Yoga is about the emotional body, the energetic body, the subtle body, how we think. So all of it is a part of it. And learning where your sit bones are. Get familiar with your body. Know your body. Love your body. And yeah, a lot of us have a lot of padding on our sit bones. Okay. Love yourself just as you are is part of the practice. So, reach down there, move the flesh away, find your sit bones and sit on them. Before we had chairs that were so cushioned and soft, if you were sitting on hard ground, believe me, you'd want to find those sit bones.
Well, I think I found mine. Anyone out there, if you're still unsure, you can Skype in and we could help you find that at Computers 2K Voice. Carol mentioned about the sit bones, the sacrum, the rounding of the back. I also am a big proponent of putting a pad on the chair seat, creating a downward slope. I'll show a downward slope. Downward slope from the hips to the knees, which allows the pelvis to position to support the spine. So notice, please, whether you're a teacher or participant or curious, if you're sitting and your knees are positioned higher than your hips. Many seniors who are used to very cushy couches, or people of all ages too, and are used to just collapsing into these devices, can find that this perpetuates some of your problems. It also compromises the ability to walk well. I find in my classes that the first step is getting this hip-knee relationship established. And almost immediately, there are positive changes in the feelings of our participants. If you're used to slumping backwards and you sit up, that could almost feel like a back bend. But that's really closer to upright than bending. So you'll try it, see how it feels, and let us know if you notice a difference, positive, negative, or just neutral. The other thing that Carol mentioned was working at a desk, and that we'll invite you to visit Carol's website, healingmoves.com, to notice her tips on the website. She also has books and videos that she's produced. One of them I'll just hold up in front of the camera and hopefully it'll focus nicely. And let's see if, yeah, there we go, a little higher. Great. So yoga to ease your aching neck and shoulders. I'm just going to lower it down. In this book, you'll find many tips for how to reduce the tension in that part of the body, but it really starts at the base and works its way up. Another opportunity for learning is through a program that Carol and a cohort, Kimberly Carson, produce at Duke Integrative Medicine. I've had the opportunity to take the course along with dozens of other teachers from around the country and world who have gotten the opportunity to experience medical professionals coming in to build insights about seniors. We're going to touch base on that program briefly and then come back to it after our sponsor spot. But Carol, can you give us a little background on how you created this program and what teachers might be able to experience in it?
Happy to. So it was 2006 when Duke Integrative Medicine first opened its doors. It's an amazing facility on the Duke University campus. It was funded initially with a $10 million grant from the John and Christy Mack Foundation, very wonderful philanthropists who believe in integrative medicine. So integrative medicine is a term for a kind of care that is emerging, very, very, very wonderful kind of care that focuses on the individual as opposed to focusing on the disease. And in addition to Western medical therapies, physicians, physical therapists, there's also an embracing of complementary therapies that have a strong evidence base, like yoga. So that's where I offer yoga therapy. There's several acupuncturists, nutritionists, massage therapists. So integrating these other healing modalities that have a strong evidence base is part of the integrative landscape. So when integrative medicine opened its doors in 2006, I was delighted to be asked to teach there. The building is beautiful. It's won architectural awards. There's an indoor waterfall, if you can believe it. It's gorgeous. They brought the staff in and asked for brainstorming about ways that we could use this brand new, beautiful facility. And I had an idea because I had been teaching at the VA, working with a population that really had medical issues and concerns. And I had personally been looking for trainings that would offer insights into what do I do if my student just had open heart surgery? What do I do if my student has had a stroke or has arthritis or had a hip replacement? I could not find yoga teacher training programs to address the needs of yoga teachers working with this population. So my idea was, let's create one ourselves. Fortunately for me, I'm married to an amazing cardiologist who was very receptive, who, he was also instrumental in creating this idea. And my dear friend Kimberly Carson had been teaching at Duke, teaching yoga at Duke for many years. She has her master's in public health. She was very involved with research into yoga and mindfulness. And so I asked Kimberly, hey, if integrative medicine's up for this, if they would agree, would you partner with me and we'll create a program for yoga teachers? We'll bring in, Mitch will come and talk about cardiovascular disease. We'll see what experts we can find to talk about the other conditions we're facing, our students are facing, concerned about. Osteoporosis was a big one, arthritis, some with dementia, chronic pain. We started out in 2007 by offering a 3-day workshop, just kind of a feasibility pilot to just see if we offer it, are people going to come? And we had to cap it at 40. That's all we could fit in the space. It filled up with a waiting list, and it was very well received, but it was clear that 3 days was not enough. So we experimented with several kinds of ways to offer the training, and we've settled on what we've now used is an 8-day, 50-hour program. It's quite intense, as you'll remember, I'm sure, Howie. We bring in Duke physicians, physical therapists. We've had exercise physiologists, health psychologists. We bring in our students to come, and we teach a class to our students. They can talk some about their own experiences and health issues. So it's a combination of lecture, experience, sharing, and we've created what we call the continuum of practice, which is a scaffolding for yoga teachers to help them figure out how to adapt the postures to be safe and effective for the person in front of us. Because in this population, you generally don't just see somebody with heart disease or just somebody with a hip replacement. They might have heart disease and a hip replacement. They might have had a stroke. So there's a lot of what we call comorbidities. So it's not well, if you have this person, you do that. It's looking at the person in front of you. These are all the considerations. What are your intentions with the pose, and how can you fit that pose to the person? It's very much, we don't feed people fish. We teach them how to fish. And we've had more than 700 yoga teachers from around the world participate in our training. And people have wanted more mentorship and training now that yoga therapy has become much more of a recognized profession. We're now offering a certification program, a mentored certification program for our graduates who are interested in doing that.
Lovely. And we can touch base more on the program in just a little bit. However, another modality of mindfulness, since you touch based on mindfulness with Kimberly, is not necessarily connecting to the outcome. A lot of times we get into processes that we think that the result is all that we're searching for and not necessarily the process. So whether you're a senior, a youth, or in between, we're going to share our Blue Lotus sponsor spot and give you a fun and yum good health tip.
Hi, I'm Jen Davis.
And I'm Kathleen Yunt. We're from Blue Lotus Yoga with today's good health tip.
Did you know that art, like coloring, has the same benefits that a meditation practice has?
Yeah, art and yoga have in common that they're both really powerful ways to move you out of the analytical or the problem-solving mind that most of us spend most of our days in. So just a simple process of taking some time to color can help you relax and refocus and rejuvenate pretty much any time of the day.
It's easy to get started too. There are lots of resources out there. For example, you can buy a coloring book that has mandalas in it. You can print them off of your computer. You can take a plain piece of paper and doodle. You can buy a set of watercolors and just move the paint around the paper. Nothing fancy. It's important that you understand that this is a process and not about creating something, some product to hang on your wall. It's an experience to relax your mind and your body. Have fun.
Thank you, Jen Davis and Kathleen Yunt from Blue Lotus Yoga. Jen and Kathleen will be teaching at Yoga Fest NC on April 8th in Raleigh at the McKimmon Center. Also teaching is Carol Krucoff, who will be teaching yoga for seniors in a 2.5-hour seminar for teachers. Another way that we're trying to advance the knowledge of adaptive and accessible yoga to the community. Carol also mentioned about posturing and positioning of the feet. We're sitting here on some stools and we're negotiating being in front of a camera, and it does take some work. We also have to remember to breathe. So viewers and listeners, whether you're teachers or practitioners, see if you can take a moment to find your feet again. Notice where they've gone. Find your sits bones and come on and sit up, because we've got some other interesting tips to share. One of the pearls that I took away from in Carol and Kimberly's training was about movement while seated. There's a lot of stress that occurs in weight-bearing areas of the spine, especially if you're seated, because we're not in our natural positioning. That's why we emphasize the angle of the thighs, the positioning of the feet, which also foster breathing. But another condition that comes up in seniors is spinal compression, cracking of vertebral bones, compressing of discs in the lower and upper neck, the lower back and the upper neck. So I'm going to ask Carol to explain some nuances for teachers and for students on this positioning and why we have to be hyper attentive to this.
One of the natural processes of aging is the loss of muscle and the loss of bone. The loss of muscle is called sarcopenia. It's the fancy medical name for age-related muscle loss. Osteoporosis or osteopenia is also loss of bone. And in osteopenia, is usually related to age, but it can also be related to other things. You can have young people with osteopenia, say a young woman who has an eating disorder and has no periods and has no estrogen can also have osteopenia. So let's not get too medical. Let's go back to the question about what does this mean for sitting. So the vertebral bodies of the spine, one of my teachers used to talk about thinking of the vertebral bodies like a string of pearls. And the natural curvature of the spine, the cervical spine naturally curves in a little bit, the lumbar spine curves in a little bit as in toward the center of the body, and the thoracic spine curves out. So there should be this natural, soft S shape. What you'll sometimes notice in older adults is that thoracic curve, which has a kyphosis, that curve away from the spine, is natural, but it can become a hyperkyphosis, excessively curved. So you'll see this bending forward of sometimes older adults, and then their head will jut forward and often their chin will jut up. And if you know somebody who looks like this, an older adult generally, and you might say, well, how tall are you now? And how does that compare to how tall you were when you were a youngster? If they've lost more than 2 inches of height, chances are that what's happened with that hyperkyphosis is they've had vertebral compression fractures. So over time, the vertebral bodies can collapse in on each other. And sometimes these start out as really micro fractures, just little cracks in the architecture. But over time, it can collapse and collapse and collapse until there's this strong hyperkyphosis in the spine. And if you ask Now, if you ask a young person who's slumped over like that to sit up straight, they can sit up straight. That's a postural hyperkyphosis. But if you ask an older adult who's had these vertebral fractures to sit up straight, I mean, that's the best they can do, because these bones are collapsed in on each other. So this is a condition that we would like to prevent as much as possible. There's not really terrific therapies for when people have this. They can inject a kind of cement into there. There's not very good therapies. Prevention is the way to go. And what we know about vertebral fractures is that there are certain positions that we can put our bodies in that increase the risk of vertebral fractures. So as yoga teachers, ahimsa, non-harming, is our first imperative. Do no harm. So what we've done in our Relax into Yoga program, that's in our new book and in our Integrative Yoga for Seniors teacher training, is we have removed from our yoga practice positions that are known to be risky. And we've learned this from our colleagues in the medical world, physical therapy. So the positions that are to be avoided are loaded flexion. Flexion's when you curve forward. Loaded means how much weight is on the spine. By virtue of sitting, when we are sitting, the spine is already loaded. That's a loaded position because the legs are out of the way, the gravity is going from the base of the pelvis to the top of the head. So when we're sitting, we need to be even more conservative about flexion. So slumped sitting, which many of us that's a habit for many of us, can lead to vertebral fractures. The safest way to do movements of the spine is to take a load off, so to do it lying down, lying on your back or on your side or on your stomach. These are all unloaded positions, so if we were going to want to take the spine into flexion, it would be okay to do it lying down, maybe curling in a fetal pose lying down, but certainly not sitting. So when we're sitting, sometimes those of us who are doing our best to adapt the yoga practice for people in a chair might not be aware that forward folding when you're sitting can put you at risk of vertebral fractures. The other important contraindication is to avoid end range rotation. So rotation is turning of the spine, and it's important to be able to turn the spine. We need to be able to turn the spine if we're going to drive, if we want to look around to see somebody behind us. Rotation is an important functional movement. What we want to avoid is going to the very end range, meaning turning as far as you possibly can and then pushing it, which is something that we do in yoga all the time. Think of poses, say seated, say Sage's twist, Ardha Matsyendrasana, where we're sitting, our knee is bent, we put our elbow on the outside of our thigh, so we're turned as far as we can, and then what do? We push on it, so we crank it more. So for someone who has compromised bone, so has bone loss, and this can be from age, it can be from medication use, so people who take steroids for long periods of time often have bone density issues. People who've had cancer treatments can have compromised bones. So end range rotation, loaded flexion are risky moves that we do not teach, and we train teachers to find other ways to get the intention of the pose without the risk.
Mm. I can appreciate folks that are tending to be seated, but there's also many a yoga practitioner, and I've seen teachers too, that attempt to do seated twists while seated on the floor or on the barest of support. And I've come to shudder when I see this, because I already have my own neck and back issues, but that there's just this resistance to propping up on bolsters, blocks, blankets, whatever it takes to get the hips higher than the knees. So I'll throw my 3 cents back in about positioning of those pelvis, of the pelvic bone relative to the knee before you start your twists. Taking a pause here, Carol's going to give us another pearl to give you a reference of how to create this nice spinal shape.
I'd like to talk about a part of the body that is not in Gray's Anatomy, but it's a very, very important part of the body to know about when you're practicing yoga, and that's called the crown of the head. So take a moment, please, and just tap yourself on the top of the head. Tap, 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 tap. I know it's a little silly, but yay, you're such a good person. So take a moment now and just rest your hand and feel into the sensation where that tapping was going on. Can you feel that place right at the very top of the skull? That's the crown of the head. And in the yogic tradition, this is a very important energy center. It's the top energy center in the chakra system. Posturally, that's the spot where we want to lift and lengthen. So you might imagine that that spot at the top of the head where you were tap, tap, tapping is a magnet. And the sky is magnetic. So see if you can feel into that sensation of rooting down through your sit bones and your feet, and from that place of grounding, lifting up the spine so that the very top of your head, so the crown of your head, extends up. And feel how you have this two-directional energetic going on, the rooting down through the sit bones, the lifting up through the crown, making space in your spine, and then send your breath into that space.
Are you extending your halos upward towards heaven? Or are you collapsing into the ground? Let's just take a moment to engage the feet, take a breath, extend the spine upward, and notice how that feels. Good. In taking Carol and Kimberly's program, we had several professionals come in. Her husband, Mitch, is a cardiologist who talked about cardiovascular disease. There's also some references that teachers should be aware of, as well as students, in terms of your head position relative to your heart and how that could affect your circulatory system and your blood pressure. Carol, any thoughts about head positioning relative to our poses?
Gravity is a factor in our lives, and it's really important to remember the effects of gravity when we're teaching, particularly when we're teaching older adults who may have heart issues. So in general, keeping the head higher than the heart is advisable when people do have cardiovascular issues. It's also important to remember that when people shift postures, they can get dizzy and lightheaded. So if you're going from lying down to sitting up, move slowly and encourage people to move slowly. We always use chairs in our work with this population. So when getting from down to up, somebody might roll over onto their side, use the strength of their hands, come to hands and knees, put their hands on the chair, and then rest. Even young people, if they pop up from lying down or sitting, can get lightheaded. This is called postural hypotension. It's a form of low blood pressure. Gravity's taking the blood away from the brain. It makes us dizzy, and falling can be a risk. So moving slowly is very important. And in general, for most older adults, keeping the head above the heart is, if they have heart issues, is generally advisable.
And building on the prior comments about the possibility of fractures in our vertebra, when one has a slumped forward position, which I can't do as readily because of my plates, there puts a lot of flexion pressure on the discs in the neck, which can cause other arthritic changes in the body, as well as more cracking of these bones that have softened over time. So please be mindful, teachers, that seniors may require slower movements, and seniors or anybody with some physical challenges, it's really okay to go more slowly with your breathing so that you do not compromise situations that are already in a potential risk. There's other medical conditions that do come up for seniors in terms of their physiology and processing, such as diabetes or neuromuscular conditions such as MS or other disconnects between the brain and body. So I'm going to ask Carol to share a little bit more about these realms over the next couple minutes.
There's really a lot to say. So I think one of the things I want to go back to is just the breath, and always come back to the breath. The breath is. People ask me what the single most important thing that you teach as a yoga therapist. I would say it's teaching people about breathing and to find their breath and to become aware of their breath. And for people with virtually any disease entity, and for those of us, and I don't include myself in this, with no disease entities at all, I certainly have my health issues. I am very human. Learning to find the breath, to become aware of the breath, and to breathe optimally is very useful. Something that's often taught in yoga classes, pranayams, are extremes of the breath. Kapalabhati breathings, shining skull breathing, or practices that involve holding the breath. So what I would want to stress is that when you're working with an older adult population with the conditions Howie just mentioned, the neuromuscular or the heart disease, with really virtually anyone in this population, avoid extremes of breath. This is not a population where you want to be doing any forceful breathing. By and large, if somebody's been practicing yoga since they were a kid and they've done Kapalabhati every day of their life and they're now 80 years old, I wouldn't take it away from them. More power to them. That's great. Their system's used to it. They know how to do it. Terrific. A new person who's just starting yoga, walking into your class in their 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th decade of life, I would stay away from extremes of breathing, and I would avoid breath holding. One thing we know about what happens when we hold our breath is that it affects our blood pressure. For many people, it will raise the blood pressure. For some people, it will lower the blood pressure. So this is not where we want to go. Many people most people over 65 in the U.S. have hypertension. That's just the fact of it. So breath holding is inadvisable, and extremes of breath are inadvisable for most people in this population.
What I've also come to find in my classes is people are just not used to thinking about breathing. And while they're focusing on the movements, many a time they won't focus on breathing and even hold their breath. So for practitioners, we invite you to think of the breath first and the movement second. And for teachers, to allow more space between the movements to be assured that people are driving the movement with the breath. We're going to take another little foray into our pearl garden and learn Carol's third pearl for our show.
Another important reference point when we're learning to sit and stand with good anatomy is the heart center. So we all know that our anatomical heart's over here on the left. In the yogic tradition, the heart center is directly in the center of the body, right in the center of the chest. So I invite you to imagine that you have a light shining out from that center. You might think of it as a headlight or maybe even a heart light. And when we're sitting or standing with good alignment, that light will shine directly forward. So we know what happens when we get tired. It's very common to slump or slouch, and then that light will be shining down. So you might catch yourself throughout the day and notice, where is that light of the heart shining? Is it shining forward or is it down? And recognize that having that good alignment, sit bones rooted down, crown of the head lifted up, light at the heart shining forward, all those 3 pointers help us maintain the good alignment that is not only important posturally for our muscles, our joints, and our bones, but for our internal organs. We can breathe fully and comfortably when we're sitting or standing with good alignment. Our digestive system, our circulatory system, our respiratory system, all can function at their optimal levels when we have this kind of good alignment. So, shine your light forward.
Feeling more radiant than usual? Well, another component of this shining the light forward would be, in my opinion, to open the slats of the blinds, which means expanding your ribs, lifting and separating them, which also fosters the breathing. So in review, we'll think of the feet down, the crown up, the heart radiating, and opening the shutters and noticing how it feels. I'm going to ask Carol if she has any other tidbits or ideas to share on her own thought rather than me inquiring with a specific question, and then we'll come back and wrap some things up.
Well, I do want to make people aware that if they're interested in breathing practice and doing a regular breathing practice, I have a free download on my website, Healing Moves, where you can download a 6-minute guided relaxation breathing practice. So many of my students put this on their phones or their computers. They use it at work. They use it to get to sleep at night. So it's out there for anybody who wants it. It's something that that I hope will be useful. Really, that I tell my students all the time, the only thing you have to do in my class is breathe. Everything else is optional. If you stop breathing, I'm going to have to ask you to leave, and hopefully that gets a laugh.
With help,
because I do like laughter and lightening it up. Not so serious, and then taking these practices into our lives. My other book, Yoga Sparks, is about these little micro practices. So Howie's been talking about teachers and practitioners. Well, I consider myself both, and I hope we're all practitioners. And yoga is not just something that we do when we're on the mat. I hope I'm practicing yoga all the time. Maybe not when I'm sleeping. If I'm unconscious, okay. But gee, standing in line at Starbucks and letting somebody else go ahead of me in line, that's a yoga practice. Not taking up more than one parking space. Aparigraha, greedlessness, that's a yoga practice. And this affects not just ourselves, but it can affect the world. Our habits of body and our habits of heart and our habits of mind have a strong impact on who we are in the world and our health.
Thank you, Carol. I'm going to, without shame, put up Carol's Yoga Sparks book and also her It's Okay, her Relaxing into Yoga for Seniors.
And that one's co-authored with Kimberly Carson.
Okay, all right. Well, too late for that. The world has seen Carol and Kimberly's book. Carol will be present with us at Yoga Fest NC on April 8th. She's accessible through her healingmoves.com website. Carol also is available for conversation in regards to teachers curious about the Duke Integrative program. You could reach her through her website there too. In addition to Yoga Fest NC on April 8th, we'll be having some warm-up Sunday programs at Lululemon in North Raleigh. If you're in our region, the next 4 Sundays, come on over at 11 o'clock and meet our Yoga Fest NC teachers. We welcome your feedback about the show. Please click on the Rate This Show. We also welcome information about other possible guests, sponsors, and topics. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you next week, or at least you seeing us unless you Skype in. Thank you, Carol, for sharing your wisdom and passion with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
To everyone else, we wish you namaste.
You're tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section on nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Atomos.com, makers of quality video recorders and converters, CarolinaApparel.com, and DeltaForce.net.